So you've been in this whole comic industry for quite a while. What is your, let's put it as an overall perspective on how the industry has changed, has evolved since you started in the 70s versus what we have now?
Well, for starters, we used to draw on cave walls. Not quite, but but really close, really close. The industry back then was all confined to New York. If you wanted to get work, you had to go to New York, which I did. And there was no such thing as creator ownership. Nobody got to own their own material. Nobody got to collect royalties on their sales or anything like that. So in mid to late 70s, I jumped ship. There was a company called Pacific Comics that started paying royalties. They offered creator ownership and royalties, and I was the first artist to sign with them. Jack Kirby was second, and Neil Adams was third. And that company blew up. It didn't have any success at all. But with that as a spark, the next company that came along was called First Comics. And I got a call from the editor who said, would you be interested in coming over here and doing anything you want? I said, sure, as long as I own it and I get royalties. And they said, that's fine, that's actually our business model. So I started working for them, and I did a book called John Sable Freelance. And it was very, very successful. Back in those days, you could walk into corporate headquarters or make a phone call in advance, talk to an editor and say, I'm here to speak to Denny O'Neil or Joe Kubert or whoever, and they'd let you right in. You could walk down the hallway. If you had an idea that you wanted to pitch to an editor, you could knock on his door, pitch the idea, and if you liked it, he'd say, hang on for a minute. He'd walk down the hallway, come back maybe 10 or 15 minutes later and say, okay, we'll give it a shot. Doesn't happen anything like that anymore.
At all.
No, it's all corporate and it's all by committee. I think what happened is that with the advent of the DC universe, the Marvel universe, and everything else switching to film, there's no doubt the total focus for the industry these days is film. They're looking for what they can develop into motion pictures and toys, and that's about it. Their secondary business is not really necessarily a money-making business in a lot of cases, is comics, and they're only using the comics to generate product. Back in the old days, the good old days, you could walk down the hallway and poke your head into anybody's office and sit down and have a chat if they weren't otherwise occupied. But everything's run to the max. I mean, it's micromanaged on the corporate level, and no one, absolutely no one, can make a decision without the committee. I've had instances where I've sent in a cover design and get a phone call from the editor just raving about the design, how much he loves it. And he'll say, I have to send it upstairs. Like, aren't you the guy who's supposed to make the decisions? But
you send it upstairs, you never really know where it goes, right?
It goes, yeah, to it's a dark and shadowy chamber where they sit around. There's a fire burning in the middle of the floor. And however they make their decisions, it takes forever. I had a pitch for a sequel to my Longbow Hunters story, and it took 3 years for corporate to come back with a no. And a sequel to Longbow Hunters is a license to print money. It really is. That book was phenomenally successful. Launched the Green Arrow comic book, which was responsible for the Arrow TV series, which was responsible for the television DCU, right? And
how does that make you feel, by the way? The fact that there's a lot of your urban hunter, your version of the Arrow in the TV show. It kind of generated an entire franchise. How does that look like for you?
I think it's great. When I saw the pilot episode, it wasn't exactly my story, but it had enough of the elements, and I thought they did just a tremendous job.
And
Stephen
Amell
is fantastic, fantastic in that role.
Yeah. And they included characters like Shadow, like
Yes.
Eddie Fries as well. So
Yes.
there's a lot of that kind of drank from your version of the Longbow Hunters.
Right, and the tattoo that he has on his back that matches Shadow's tattoo.
Yeah, exactly. Really fun. I would like to have your perspective on something.
Sure.
A lot of the times you see that in the beginning the comic books generate the TV show, and at some point it kind of becomes a synergy the other way around.
Yes.
Do you feel that happens a lot as well when it comes to like the massive corps? And has that happened to you in that sense? Were you involved in post-Arrow TV show? Were you involved again in producing?
It actually happened that way with the Arrow TV series. Arrow was spawned by the Green Arrow, the Longbow Hunters, and then they turned around and decided to do a digital comic book based on the TV series, and that was not so successful because what they were trying to do is use the comic book to fill in the gaps between the episodes of the TV series. And the problem with that is that if you missed an episode of the TV series, you wouldn't understand what the comic book was about. And most of the writers were staff members on the TV series, producers and staff members. There were a couple of scripts that came through that were just fantastic because the guy really understood how to introduce characters, how to develop the plot, how to increase the threat, how to complicate matters, and how to pay it off with something that was very, very satisfactory. That when I got a chance to work with that particular writer, I wrote my first fan letter. And and I said, this is great, because by comparison to the other scripts I worked on, which were pretty bad, well, it's a case of two different mediums. For instance, a screenwriter will frequently write a comic book script where the description of one panel is that the hero smashes through the door, rolls on the floor, comes up to his feet, and punches out the bad guy. Well, that's 3 panels. That's not one panel, right?
Okay.
You can't do that all in one panel.
Yeah, makes sense. Of course, you have to kind of stretch it out.
Yeah,
different. So to make the movements perceptible, right?
Right, different kinds of storytelling.
Yeah.
In comic, we hit the high points.
Yeah. Yesterday or 2 days ago, I heard you say in a panel, which was a very interesting perspective to pick up on, that at some point in time you sometimes had to depict certain scenes or certain characters in your comics that do not necessarily match with who you are. Like, I think you mentioned an example where you've been called a misogynist where you're not necessarily a misogynist, right?
Oh.
Do you feel that this is something that happens frequently when we're talking about these big corporations, these DC, these Marvel, etc., which is maybe in contrast less frequent to when you're doing your own projects, right? Your own independent work.
I think what happens is that because the fans become so invested in the characters, they take everything very, very personally, and they don't understand that my job as a writer is not necessarily to answer all the questions, but my job is to ask the questions, okay? I point out things. If I'm doing a story that has to do with domestic violence, doesn't mean I'm promoting domestic violence. Yeah. Someone said, that I had showed Dinah Lance as a victim. Well, the fact is that in violent cases, especially domestic cases, women are more often the victims than the men because, frankly, women are easier to beat up. I mean, they really are. That's only half a joke, okay? And when I'm doing a story, what I'm looking for is the emotional hook that will launch the story and the characters further on into a different direction. And with Green Arrow, the Longbow Hunters in particular, Denny O'Neil had created a scenario where the character of Green Arrow, Oliver Queen, had accidentally killed a guy. And he swore he would never kill again. Burned his bow, shaved his head, joined a monastery, and withdrew from society. And in order to do the kind of stories, the hard-edged, real-world stories that I wanted to do, dealing with everyday life, for the most part, I took a lot of my stories came straight off the headlines. I couldn't do that, so what I had to do was create a scenario where Green Arrow, Oliver Queen, would make that conscious decision to change. When he finds Dinah Lance has been captured by the bad guys, and when he comes on the scene, she's been strung up from a forklift. The bad guy's got her hair in one hand and a knife in the other. And I've already demonstrated earlier in the book that it's nothing for Oliver Queen to shoot the knife out of the guy's hand, but instead he shot him square through the heart. And that was a conscious decision that he made because, frankly, he had it coming. That's number one. But it was also that transition point where, from that moment on, the character of Oliver Queen changed.
His character development.
Right. His direction changed. It changes your life if you're involved in an incident like that. You can't just pretend it never happened. When my guys get shot or wounded in one issue, the next issue they're not all completely healed again, right? Because you have to show the consequences. And in the case with Oliver and Dinah, who had up until that point a terrific sex life. I mean, even when Denny was doing it, everyone knew they were living together. Everyone knew they weren't married, and everyone with a brain knew darn well that they were in bed every chance they got. So I showed how that relationship was so strong and their bond was so tight that when he made that conscious decision to kill a guy, to save her, it had an emotional impact. But then I didn't just ignore it. When I continued the Green Arrow series afterward, I came back to that same scenario, picked it up where it left off. I didn't just ignore what had happened before. And all of a sudden, from a rather heated sexual relationship that they had, all of a sudden Dinah can't stand to be touched. And Oliver has his own problems. He has basically PTSD when he's thinking about what he's done. And I compared it to standing on the edge of a cliff. If you jump, you can't unjump. You can't change your mind halfway down.
Of course.
And I was able to turn that around later on in the series where Oliver is the one who's been captured by the bad guys. And he's been tortured. And Dinah comes to his rescue because Dinah was always Oliver's hero. Always. And in the last scenes, she's literally fought her way into a building where he's being held captive, and he's all beat up. And she's fought off the bad guys, and she's got 2 bullets left in her gun. And she's cradling him in her arms and says, "Don't worry, Oliver. I won't let them hurt you again." 1 bullet for him, 1 bullet for her.
It's the consequence of the first action, right?
Exactly. And I enjoy raising those questions, making people think about what the possible consequences could be.
Exactly.
In a lot of instances, sometimes it turns pretty funny. After Longbow Hunters came out, I had a plot that involved the CIA, and there was a phone call that I got from a New York radio station asking if I'd be willing to come on live on the radio and talk about how I managed to beat the news of the Iran-Contra drugs for gun scandal into print by 6 months. And I said, sure. And when I was on the air, I said, look, I kept up with the news because that's where I got ideas for my stories. And then I just plugged in all the players into the plot line that I had already created, and I asked myself, okay, in a case where you're dealing with drugs coming out of South America and the CIA is involved, I just asked myself, what would be the stupidest thing these guys could possibly do if they were absolutely certain they would never get caught? And that's what I wrote. And the funny thing is that later on it occurred to me that the NSA, National Security Agency, reads everything that's going to be published. They read books and novels in the galleys, okay, the before it's ever printed. Yeah. And we had a 6-month lead on the
actual event.
The Longbow Hunters, and so my story was already written and it was drawn, completely finished 6 months before it ever went into print. And I'd like to think that it's just possible that somebody from NSA went down the hallway and knocked on Oliver North's door and said, hey, Ollie, have I got an idea for you? And the guy's name is even Oliver. It's possible.
It is. Why not?
Why not?
Exactly. Oh, I could spend the entire day listening to all these stories because they're wonderful. I have one final question for you. And my final question is, what do you think is the future for artists in comic books? You've done a massive career, and we started off this conversation with that, with your beginnings. What do you believe is the future for artists, for writers in this world, well, where technology is everywhere, where you can draw by clicking or...
I got a phone call from a guy a few weeks back who said, you know, what we should do is take your drawings, your loose drawings, just a scribble sketch, and plug it into an AI program and let the AI finish it off. And I said, are you freaking nuts? I will die with my pencil in my hand. There will always be future technology that will come in. It'll be useful to a certain extent, but being able to pick up a pencil or a pen and create something on paper from your imagination to your hand will never die. There's a reason why fine art, really great art, lasts through the centuries. And I'm not saying that my work will last through the centuries, but somewhere on down the line, somebody's going to pick up a magazine that I've done illustrations for, or find a moldy box of comics in an attic somewhere, and when they open it up and there's one of my books, that'll be my moment of immortality. But it's not going to be through AI, I can guarantee you. I think there will always be an outlet for gifted, talented people who can express themselves, create everything from their own imagination and their own talents, put it down on paper, create it, send it out into the world, and it'll find a home.